Right. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're doing another Med Mentor Monday, and we're going to be talking about the topic, Am I ready to apply to medical school? Some housekeeping topics just before we begin. Please direct your questions to the Q&A Zoom feature, not the chat. The Zoom chat should just be for technical difficulties that you have. And then if you're submitting questions to the Q&A, try to keep it as broad as possible and not specific questions so that we can keep the session as productive as possible for everybody. If there are questions that are specific to you, we have a specific form that you can fill out that is for asking Med Mentors. And that being said, we're currently joined by two medical student panelists and we'll be joined by another soon. I would love for you both to introduce yourselves and I would love to have you say your name, your year, the program that you're part of, and if you took any gap years, and if you did, what you did during those gap years. Amelia, you're unmuted, so I'll call on you first.
I just realized I was muted, so sorry. Hi, everyone. My name is Amelia. I'm a second-year medical student in the MD program here at UCLA. And for us, for those of you who are unfamiliar, that means I'm on my clinical year right now. I'm actually on my neurology rotation. Lots of questions that I totally forget I'm supposed to answer. I went to Case Western Reserve University out in Cleveland, Ohio for my undergrad, where I got a BS in biology, and I actually didn't take any gap years. I'm one of the COVID graduates, graduated during the COVID era and came straight to medical school for a variety of reasons that COVID actually made possible in a lot of very interesting ways that I'm happy to talk about as well. And I'm really passionate about this stuff, and so really excited for you guys on your journey and hope this is helpful. What else was I supposed to answer?
Amazing. That's all great. That's all great. And then George, feel free to introduce yourself as well.
Sure. My name is George Aguilin. I'm actually in the same cohort as Amelia, but I'm in the MSTV track, so taking some time off doing a PhD. I went to Caltech for my undergrad. I did take a gap year. I was initially planning on applying straight through, but kind of having discussions with family and with my PI, decided to go down, take a gap year and then begin the MD component. I think that was it. Was there anything else?
That's great.
I was going to give bank account information, social security number,
That's all great too. We would love to have that recorded. So we're also going to be joined by Brandon soon. And I'll also introduce myself. My name is Rohini Knott. I'm an MS4 technically. I'm in the class of 2024. And I am in the traditional Westwood track. I didn't take any gap years. I went straight through. I graduated in 2020. So it was also COVID era. But I've had a really good experience at DGSOM and happy to answer any questions that people have. But with that being said, we're going to start with the first part of our session, which is preparing your application. And I would love to have us chat about what are the different components of the medical school application that people should be compiling.
Yeah, I'll sort of start off with a little bit of an overview. As much as I believe, and a lot of schools believe, that this should not be a checkbox process. This really should be an organic decision that sort of you come to. And I know that's a really frustrating answer. We all know that there are some checkboxes. And so it's helpful for me to conceptualize it in terms of what are the kinds of things that you need to do before you can be a good, successful medical student. And the biggest question to answer is, am I prepared for this profession? Is this the profession that's for me? And there's a couple ways that you can demonstrate that to admissions committees, and as well as answer that question for yourself. And so shadowing is actually a really big deal. Making sure that you're getting some face time with some doctors, actually understanding what the lifestyle is about, and getting a real understanding of what a physician's day-to-day might look like, because it can be very different than maybe what you might think, or maybe it's the same, who knows, but it's good to get that confirmation. And then, so that's sort of your clinical experiences, and shadowing is one way to do that. So I should be clear. I was an EMT in college, and so I actually didn't do that much shadowing, and I did a lot more other clinical experiences, and those fulfill that box as well. I know that George has an extensive research background, and so he can talk to you about what that might look like as well. But I do think that more and more, some schools are starting to hope that their medical students have some background in academia, and that can look like a lot of different things. As long as you have some kind of academic passion, or you have something that you could have shown a long-term commitment to, that's also a big deal. I think that's a good sort of foundation, and of course, you got to get your GPA and all of your prerequisite coursework and your MCAT and all that good stuff. That's sort of a given as well.
Yeah, I really love the perspective that you're giving, because I feel like sometimes people can focus on numbers of GPA, MCAT score, certain hours of research, certain number of publications, certain number of clinical hours. But I think it is very much, a lot of schools are moving towards that holistic process. And I think the biggest thing is, we went through the first year of preclinical, and, going through the medical content is not easy, but it's so much more than that, than just learning, the clinical material, passing exams. It's, being a physician and preparing to be a physician is so much more than that. And I think those are some of the traits that will come across, whether that be through your research, kind of showing that you can think critically, ask good questions, put together good experiments, and be able to tease apart why things went wrong, and how you can approach things. In the clinical sphere, are you able to take initiative? Are you able to kind of pick up on those, like, people call it soft skills? I don't like that, but like those soft skills of, like, how do you interact with patients? Because those are things that will be as critical as, like, the book stuff of learning, mechanisms and pathways, and and the pharmaceuticals. So I think it's super important to kind of have those things down. I think regardless of what sphere you're working on, whether that be, doing the shadowing or the research, you really want to show an initiative. So for example, when you're doing research, you want to be able to ask those questions and be able to pose those research projects, and kind of show that you have taken on something and taken it to completion. In the clinical sphere, you want to show that you have that enthusiasm, you're excited to learn. And I think as someone, as you guys are thinking about applying to med school, just keeping in mind those various components. It's a lot of things to juggle, but you definitely want to make sure that in all of those different things, one, you're doing something you're passionate about, and two, you're really doing your very best to kind of show initiative in those things. But as Emilia said, unfortunately, certain things are checkboxes. For example, for those who are kind of pursuing an MD PhD route, clinical hours may not be as important as the number of hours you're doing research in. But still, I think it's super important to be able to show that you're able to communicate with patients, you're able to do research, you're able to do all these different things. Because once you're a clinician, you're going to have to juggle all these things. So yeah, that was a long ramble of just saying that there's so many components. But I think as long as you're passionate about what you're doing, it'll come across in your application, and especially during interviews when you get to actually talk about this stuff in ad nauseum.
Thank you both so much. Those were really, really helpful answers. And welcome to Brandon, who's another one of our panelists. We were just answering the question whether the different components of the medical school application. I think both of those pieces of advice were really helpful. And another thing that I think was really helpful for me was, even before I was in my application cycle and thinking about applying, I got a piece of advice from someone who was senior to me to just look at the AMCAS application early on, so you know what all of the different components are. So that the first time you open the application, it's not necessarily right when you have to submit it. So you're able to assemble those things and know that you're going to need to have up to 15 experiences that you can log down, and 3 of those will be most meaningful, or that you have to put a personal statement, and how many characters do you get. So I think that just going online to the AMCAS website is really helpful for getting a sneak preview. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is thinking about the timeline of applying to medical school. For some people who are thinking about med school versus other paths, or thinking about applying to med school when they're considering gap years or in their senior year of college, or whatever that timeline looks like, what do you think is a good timeline to start thinking about applying to medical school? any recommendations for when people should take the MCAT, and any recommendations for when people should start preparing their actual application. So that's a lot, but hopefully that gives you all something to work with.
Hi everyone, I'm Brandon. I am a MD PhD student, second year of PhD. So I've already done my first 2 years of med school. I was an undergrad at UCLA. I graduated in 2017, so I know a lot of ins and outs because I've been at UCLA for like 10 years. So in terms of deciding when to apply to medical school, so I didn't decide to apply to medical school until winter quarter of my senior year. So, you know, that may seem late for some people. Like some people like are born and they know they want to be doctors. For me, I didn't know until, you know, very late in my like undergrad college experience. And because of that, I didn't prepare for the MCAT. I didn't really do a lot of like clinical experiences or whatever. You know, I didn't really have a medical school application prepared. So I took 2 years off just working and doing research at UCLA. And during that time, I really looked at, you know, what do I need to do to have a successful application? I didn't really have a lot of clinical experience, so I knew that I needed clinical experience. So that was number one. Number two was the MCAT, right? Like I hadn't taken the MCAT, so I needed to take some time to study for the MCAT and then take the MCAT. So those were my big areas that, you know, looking ahead to when I would write my application, those were the areas that I knew were going to be lacking. Oh, also letters of recommendations, right? Like I wasn't really considering applying, so I had to like think about, all right, who will my letter writers be if I don't have a letter writer from this domain? If I don't have a letter writer from like humanities or, you know, my coursework or whatever, let's start to think about, you know, forming those relationships with professors.
You want to go or should I go? I can go. Kind of to add on to that, a couple of things to keep in mind as you're thinking about, you know, applying to schools. First of all, are you going to be taking a gap year or are you going to be applying straight through? You know, that's something that you have to kind of think about. And I think just general timeline of things, if you're planning on applying straight through, I think most people end up taking their MCAT before their, it would be this, most people end up doing it the summer before their junior year or during the fall of their junior year, because they'll be submitting their applications by the June of their junior year, such that they have interviews during their senior year and then they go straight through. So that's generally the timeline if you're planning on applying straight through. If you're planning on taking a gap year or gap years, then of course things shift. I think for me, things were a little bit different just because of COVID. I initially I applied June of my senior year. I was initially going to take the MCAT that March, but because of COVID, of course, everything got pushed. I ended up taking my MCAT after I submitted my primary applications, just because things got rescheduled so many times. But yeah, I think generally the timeline is you take the MCAT upwards of like 6 months before you submit your application. Some people take it, you know, much closer to the time you submit. But June, you end up submitting your primary application, and that consists of your personal statement and your why medicine essay. In addition to like all your extracurricular activities, your rec letters. When you submit that, I think it has to be verified. There's a verification process of, especially for your transcript. And then after that point, schools start getting back to you with regards to secondary. So that ends up being an onslaught of a lot of essays to write, because each school has a lot of very specific topics. But yeah, that's generally the timeline of like the application process. But as Brandon mentioned, a couple of things to keep in mind. You know, if you are planning on taking a gap year, really important to make sure that you have a lot of things documented. And also, if you're planning on getting rec letters, make sure to keep in touch with those faculty, because you know you're no longer going to be at that school. It's good to make sure that they still know who you are, and you know, preferably even before you graduate, you can talk to them and maybe they can start writing their letter from them and have it just saved, so that whenever you do apply, at least they can just use that directly and they don't have to kind of go back through their paperwork and remember the stuff that you've done with them. Another thing, kind of going back to the previous question that we had, something that's really helpful and that helped me was kind of making a running list of various things you've done. I think once you're sitting down to do the application, and once you're sitting down to write your essays, it's really helpful to kind of refer back to the various things that you've done over the years. And I think sometimes especially as you get close, you kind of forget all the various things that you took part in, or the various things you were passionate about during your freshman, sophomore, junior year. So it's good to have like a running document of like, oh, I took part in these activities and I was really passionate about these things in my freshman, sophomore, junior year. If anything else comes up, I'll mention.
I really love the advice about the journaling. It's something that I think is really crucial, just so that you can remind yourself why you joined something, what it meant to you, what you got out of it, because that's going to be the crux of your secondaries especially, and I'm sure part of your primary, your personal statement as well. Something else that I wanted to mention is also, I know that not everybody might agree with this, and so please get advice from lots of different people, but I really think that it's crucial before you apply to have a bit of a sense of like what your thesis is. Why do you want to go to med school? Like what kind of applicant, not that you have to be in one particular bucket, but what kind of applicant are you? Like what is your mission in applying to med school, and what kind of physician do you want to be? These are questions that should be answered in like a neat little package that will eventually turn into your personal statement and should be supported as evidenced by all of your work and activities, and hopefully your letters of rec, although you have no control over what exactly gets written. Hopefully you have some idea of what your letter writers will be saying about you based on how you choose them, things like that. And so your work and activity section includes all of your gap year activities as well. And so this is something to think about. You should have a nice little package of all the things that you've done, pointing you in the direction of your future. And that is your thesis. That is what your application should convey. If you're sitting there and you don't have a thesis yet, or you feel that you have a strong work and activities section that is filled with lots of different things that just has no direction, that's a good time to sit down, perhaps with med mentors. We love to do this in our peer advising or on our one-on-ones, but something else that is helpful for you to do is sit and reflect if this is the year for you to apply, only because you want to have that direction going in, just because A, it'll help you with your application, and B, it'll help you in med school knowing that you really had a mission when you were doing this. If your application feels directionless, it'll be really hard to get through the application cycle. I know that's kind of vague, and it will be very context dependent, but that really informs, the kind of gap year jobs that you would go for, the kind of things you emphasize in your application. Ultimately, it helps you highlight what your weaknesses in your application are so that you can start to fill them, and that will help you plan for your timeline. If you realize once you've put it all together, oh no, I'm trying to be a really clinical applicant and I just have so many research hours and no clinical hours, but that's the mission that I'm trying to portray, that's a good time to step back and say, maybe I need to show that, evidence that with another activity or another year of activities before I apply again. It is tougher to apply the second time. That's just a fact. They ask you to explain what went wrong the first time. That is not an easy question when this is such a rat race in a lot of ways. And so you just want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward. And what I've found in my own experience and in mentoring others is that if you're able to summarize your thesis, you have a good chance of making a good application. And if you're struggling to do that, please reach out for help. Maybe we can help you do that. But if we're all struggling to do that, it might point to some deficiency that then you can plan for so that you can apply with the strongest application. I hope that makes some sense.
I do want to add that it's okay to apply more than once. I know a handful of friends who did not get in the first time around for whatever reason, but ended up going to medical school one way or another. So it is not looked down upon at all. Like, sure, you lose some time and lose a lot of money with applications, but if you want to be a doctor and you don't get in the first time you apply, beef up your application and apply again, because you'll do it.
Thank you. Literally, thank you so much for that. I second that a lot. I know a lot of people who've applied the second time around, third time around, and have gotten in. So it's not an issue to apply again. But like Brandon said, it does take, that's another year of commitment, and it is tough. Absolutely doable and worth it, but tough.
Yeah, I definitely concur as well. One thing I do want to add is I really love the idea of having like a central thesis to kind of drive as you're approaching applications, especially because like that will be the crux of your interviews as well. I mean, time and time again, you're going to be asked, why medicine? Why did you decide to pursue medicine? And what about medicine kind of drives you? And being able to answer that question is going to be so critical during your interviews, during your primary and secondary applications. So I think that's something you definitely should put some thought into. And another thing is even, kind of coming up with that and talking to family, friends, people who know you well. Because another thing is this has to be genuine. This has to be authentic. It has to be you. You can't put together a beautiful storyline and just, that's not you. Because it comes across during your essays, it comes across during your interviews. You got to be super genuine and kind of really think hard about like, what is it about medicine that excites me or drives me? Yeah, I would definitely, recommend doing that. Another thing I was going to mention, it was about gap years, but I'll mention it later once we have more questions relevant to that. Yeah.
This is all really great for segueing into the next part of this, which is deciding not to apply and thinking about when should you postpone your application. The advice that's been given is really, really great. I'm wondering for a lot of students who might not have a bunch of clinical experience because of COVID, or who didn't pursue research because of whatever reasons. I've heard students say that research personally wasn't that interesting to them, or they didn't have the opportunity to shadow, and they have these elements of their application that aren't there. What would you recommend to those students in terms of getting some of those things on their application? When do you think it's okay to not have some of those things? Or would you just recommend students get all of those things? What is your opinion on that?
I can go first again. So I have looked at applications and interviewed students for the MD PhD program. And, when I talk to them, oftentimes I'll ask like, hey, what happened during COVID? And those tell me like, oh, I had these things lined up, but obviously I couldn't do them. And I'm like, great. Like, I totally understand. Like, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to hold that against someone. Like, things are just like completely out of your control, right? But like, there are things you can, like, just because COVID happened doesn't mean like, you sit around on your ass all day and like don't do anything. So really, again, take a look at your whole package. Do you have a story? And like, what are the areas that are lacking? And then like, you really just focus in on those areas that you think are weaker. So for example, let's say, for example, for COVID, you didn't get to shadow and you had a shadowing thing lined up. Like, now go reach out to doctors and see if you can shadow. I mean, like, honestly, you don't really need that many hours of shadowing to like get something meaningful out of it. So you just really have to sit back and look at the whole application and really find, your strengths and weaknesses and target those weaknesses. And also, if you feel like you need another year to get a better application to have a really strong chance of getting a position in medical school, at the end of the day, like, medical training is a really, really long process. What's another year, right? Like, George and I are doing the MD PhD. That's like a whole 8-year process. What's another year of being a doctor? Like, you're going to be a doctor at the end, practicing medicine for an extra year. I mean, what's the big deal? That's my opinion anyway.
I totally agree. The other thing that I want to say is that this can turn into just like an infinite process, like you just really asymptotically reach your best application, and you could put in another year and you could put in another year. And I know my answer to the last question was like to do this process and to like look at your deficiency and then make up for it and then have a better application. So I know this might be contradictory, but just recognize that there comes a point where you come to marginal returns. Just go for it. If you think you have a good application, go for it. Don't be worried. You can, we're never going to have 100% of everything. Just just, if you feel strong, if you have a thesis, I say go for it. If you think that your work and activities, it could be better, but it is there, go for it. Absolutely go for it. The main thing is being able to articulate what your mission in medicine is. And if you're able to do that, I think you have a strong application. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is this is a really long process, and this is a really, in a lot of ways, kind of streamlined process. Once you're in medical school, you do the things and you keep doing the things until you get to the end. And there are a lot of ways to branch out from that once you're in it, but it is easier to do that before. If you have another thing in mind to do for your life, like go for it, like pursue that before going into medicine if that's something that you're interested in. I would say that I know a lot of people who've had entire careers before coming into medicine because they had a passion and they wanted to pursue that fully. I'd say go for it. You don't have to come to medicine first. Medicine will always be there if that's what you're really passionate about. And so if you have more passions, do explore those and don't feel any pressure that you have to come to medicine at a certain time. This will be there. If you really want to be a doctor, you will become one and you will be good. So, do your life as you want to. Don't feel pressured to apply too early, if that makes sense.
Yeah, completely agree. And I forget the exact statistic, but it's surprising like how high the median like age is for like, your typical med student. So it's completely normal to take several years off. As Amelia mentioned, like we have people in our class that have like years of biotech experience, or have had different careers and now have changed trajectory. So it's completely normal to do that. I think the key is kind of not losing that vision. So as long as you still have that passion of like wanting to pursue medicine, whenever you feel like it's the right time, I think you definitely should go for it. Another thing is, a friend of mine, Christian, he said, don't call it gap years, call it enrichment years, because these are opportunities for you to learn. If during your gap year, you're just waiting around to, put together an application, it's going to be a waste of time. But if during the gap year, you're doing something, you're learning, you're doing research, you're getting involved in industry, I feel like that will prepare you so that once you're a med student, you'll have a unique background and experience so that you can then use that in the clinic or in the research setting. So definitely, I think it's good to have that background. Another thing is, I know that it's been tough with regards to doing shadowing, given that it's COVID, and I know that there's still a lot of institutions that don't allow undergrads to shadow, kind of still provided that COVID has been going on. But I don't think that bars students from kind of being creative in ways of coming up with different opportunities to interface with patients. So I know that mobile clinic is definitely a super active part of UCLA, and I know that as far as I know, I think undergrads are, actively involved in that. That's one way you can get involved. Another, there are so many different opportunities that you can make use of, whether it be like putting together a drive or kind of doing teaching, medical related teaching, healthcare related teaching in high schools. There's a lot of different ways that you can, actively get involved despite the challenges of being able to shadow. So I think definitely something worth brainstorming, with med students, with your fellow classmates. And last thing, kind of unrelated, but with regards to talking about story, kind of your central thesis. One thing I do want to mention is it's okay if the reason that you went into medicine sounds stereotypical. A lot of people are interested in medicine because, they go through some sort of hardship, whether it be in family, someone kind of experiences some sort of health crisis, and that kind of, for them inspires them to say, look, I want to be able to help others just like others were able to help, me or my family members. And it's completely okay to talk about that. I think people are sometimes, shy away from that, thinking that, they need to come up with the most novel, personal statement, when that's actually not the case. I think you need to be super genuine with regards to that story and what actually drives you. And the novelty, I think, comes with how you respond to that situation and how you grew from that situation, not so much the story itself. For me, it was also a healthcare situation with my grandfather, and like being able to go through that inspired me for medicine. And someone else might have the same exact scenario, but very different story. And being able to talk about that in your essays, I think, is super critical. One thing that my PI kept on telling me was like, George, don't tell, show. Don't tell me that you have, you're excited about these things, you're passionate about these things. Show me, tell me stories, tell me instances of how, what happened in your life, what actually drove you to do these things. So I think when you do that, that's the novelty of the situation. That's the novelty of your story. So don't shy away from kind of being genuine. And if it was like a family crisis or something that kind of led you to medicine, then that's completely okay. And yeah, because the only reason I mentioned this, because a lot of people, like, I've had a couple of people come up and they're like, oh, I'm interested in medicine because of these reasons, but I don't know if I should talk about it. No, you should. If that's something you're passionate about, if that's your story, then you definitely want to make sure you talk about it.
Amazing. The next question is just about the timing of when to submit the application and when you felt like your application was 100% complete, or if you even ever got there. I personally don't think I ever felt like my application was 100% complete. So the question is, when you applied to medical school, did you ever feel like your application was complete, or what helped you decide to press that submit button, and what you would recommend to students who might have a pending MCAT or pending shadowing experience or something that's they're thinking, should I wait to get this done before submitting my application versus submitting their application as early as possible? How would you decide between that trade-off, and any advice?
My advice is really simple. It's to go as soon as possible. I know not everybody agrees with that, so I'm really interested to hear the other panelists' opinions too. But it is a rolling application for most schools. And if you're not pressing the submit button, other people are, and you might have just as good of an application as somebody else, and they're pressing the button instead of you. I think that you do as much as you can for your application up until when it opens, and then you submit it. That's the advice that I give to everybody, because you never know who would love you, and you should give them the opportunity to take a look. I know that's not ideal in every scenario. It can be context dependent, but in the majority of cases, that's the right move, because this is a rolling application.
I always have a hard time answering like the timing questions, because I think the MD PhD applications is like super different from like just regular med school applications. Like, I did not care to submit my applications right away. In fact, I like submitted super late, but like we have our own pool of applicants, so it's like I don't really have much to comment here.
Yeah, it was the same for me too. I did submit it relatively late. But one thing I do want to mention, just because I think people can get neurotic about this, if there are issues in the applications, there are errors, typos, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. There were like, I remember I was, first of all, like, thank God I got into the program, but the application timeline for me was pushed because of COVID. I submitted my application relatively late, and my secondaries, I think it was like early fall. So I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna get in anywhere. But again, thank God it worked out. There were typos in my essays sometimes because of like just weird stuff happening with the computer. What I'm trying to get at is, I think at the end of the day, we're all human. Try your very best to make sure that you submit the best version of yourself. But again, if you're passionate about medicine, that's going to come across regardless. Especially, once you get interviews, being able to be genuine, all those errors will go to the side. So yeah, just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, I just want to add just an insider tip, having like read applications and interviewed people. Like, nitty-gritty details in your writing really do not matter at all. Like, you're spending hours and hours writing the essays. I'm spending minutes reading them, like if that, you know? So like, don't slave away, like, oh, does this phrasing sound better? Does this phrasing sound better? Like, I don't care when I'm reading it, as long as I get the story that you're trying to tell me and I get the meaning and the message behind, you know, your essay, I'm good to go. So nitty gritty details in that don't, I mean, like, yeah, like pay attention to what you're writing and like, of course, again, put your best foot forward, but at the end of the day, not that important.
And I'll throw in my 2 cents as someone who applied just for MD programs. I think that at least for applicants that I've worked with, thinking about, do I submit this as early as possible to get as many eyes on my application early and potential early interviews versus do I delay my application? It's really individual dependent. And I think that sometimes we know our applications well and we know the things that we've done, but sometimes we have blind spots, and really getting as many eyes on your application as early as possible. I think now is not even like, it's never too early to do it. So I think that like med mentors, or if you know somebody who's applied to medical school and would be able to offer you insight, just looking over your application, it can help in making that decision of, do I apply this cycle versus do I defer and take a gap year? I think that those options to me are a little bit more ideal than waiting to submit an application later in the cycle because you waited, you wanted to make sure everything was 100% complete. I think submitting it either really early or saying, okay, there are some deficiencies in my application that I think that just the cost of applying to medical school is so much that I would be better off taking a gap year and then figuring out what can I do during my gap year to make sure my application is strong as possible, to put my best foot forward and apply early in the next cycle is personally what I would do and what I advise to people. Okay, another question is for students who are feeling uncertain or overwhelmed about taking a gap year, what recommendations do you have for students who are thinking about taking a gap year, and any advice that you would give to somebody who's thinking about should they take a gap year or not?
With regards to that, I think there's a few things to consider. I don't know if you should take a gap year if you haven't decided what you're going to be doing in the gap year. I think you should have a generally delineated timeline of what you plan on doing during the gap year, whether that be going in the industry, doing research, traveling. At least having a goal. That way you don't burn through the year and turn around and look like, oh shoot, I should have done something. So having some timeline, I think, is really helpful. Another thing is I think just talking to others, family, classmates, any mentors that you have, to see, is taking another year going to be advantageous to you, or if anything, is it going to kind of dwindle that passion that you might have? Because another thing to be mindful of, I think, with regards to taking time off is, right now you're super passionate about pursuing medicine. And I feel like if you take a lot of time off, and I say this with a caveat that there are people that are able to do whole careers and then, come back to medicine. So that's perfectly okay. But I do want to mention that, you definitely want to make sure that if this is something you're actually interested in pursuing, that you still find avenues to reassure that and to kind of bolster and strengthen that. I don't know if that makes sense. Just because I know that there were times during my gap year that, especially, as you're writing essays, you can get really disillusioned into wondering why medicine. I mean, especially when you're writing secondaries, you're asking yourself, am I really, is medicine really right for me? You're writing hundreds of pages of, or not hundreds, but tens of pages of material. So definitely make sure that you keep your fuel going during your gap year. Yeah, that's at least from my experience, something I could recommend.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I also saw a question in the Q&A about reducing burnout, and I think this really ties into it because I have all the stock answers for how to reduce burnout, but like self-care it only goes so far. What really helped me is to have is to have something to anchor on, something to feel like is really keeping me going. And that was my thesis. That was my mission. That was why I was applying into medicine. And even when everything sucked and I didn't want to write anymore and the application process was like grueling and I was tired, and it's a brutal process of introspection. And when I felt completely like I just, there are those moments during the cycle, and to be able to latch on and say, no, I wanted to do this because of this reason. This is why I'm doing this. That actually helped me get through the cycle and to find my strength, because it felt real. It felt like something I really could anchor on. And that's how I reduced burnout. But that's the same advice for people going into this gap year. I really agree with George and our mutual friend Christian's advice about calling them enrichment years, because seriously, this is not a gap in your life. This is meant to be a continuation of everything that you are, and then you'll bring all of that with you when you come into medicine at whenever that is right for you, and to feel like, oh, I'm taking a break or I'm taking a gap might feel very daunting, and to instead say like, oh, I'm finding an expertise in something else, whether that is in something medicine-y like research or industry or something like that, or if it's in something completely different, if you are going into business or retail or whatever you're gonna do, all of that will eventually contribute to the kind of person you are as a doctor and the kind of physician you'll be. And so to think about what are your takeaways that you want from your year are super important, so that you can bring that with you into your journey in medicine. And ultimately, you'll be able to write about that if you're very intentional about it. Hope that helps.
Amazing. Thanks so much, everyone. I want to move us towards the open Q&A, because I know we have a lot of questions coming through chat, and then a lot of you submitted great questions. The first question I wanted to ask, because it's been coming up, is what would you recommend to people who don't have like traditional clinical or scientific research on their application? Is this a must to apply to medical school? What are your thoughts?
You want to go, Brent?
You go first.
Cool. Real quickly. No, it doesn't matter. There's a lot of people that come in with very hardcore organic chemistry background. People who have like pure physics research, it's okay. I think the biggest takeaway is, were you able to take a project, regardless of what the field is, and are you able to ask good questions? I think that's going to be the most critical component. The type of research you do, no, it almost has, I mean, it would be nice to be able to make the connection of like, oh, I saw something in the clinic and that inspired my research. But I think more important than that is, are you able to think outside the box, ask good questions, because at the end of the day, as a clinician, you're also technically a researcher too. As you're approaching these diagnoses, you're writing up a clinical report, sometimes doing clinical trials. I mean, you have to, those skills carry over, even though it's not the same topic. So it doesn't necessarily have to be hardcore clinical work or hardcore basic science work. It could honestly be pretty much anything.
Yeah, I'd say the subject of your research doesn't matter. How good you are at research doesn't matter. What matters is that, you have to recognize that medicine is completely driven off of research, right? Like the COVID vaccines, like that was all driven from research. Anything you learn in medical school was all like driven by research. So demonstrating that, you recognize that medicine is all research driven, you can appreciate the science behind medicine, you can work in research teams or like work in teams in general, think about problems, be a critical thinker, problem solve. Those are all the traits that they're really looking for when you say like you do research, right? Like, I applied MD PhD, so research was supposed to be a really, really big component of my application. I didn't talk about how I was a kick-ass researcher. I talked about all the things that I learned working in a research environment, working with teams, like taking on my own projects, thinking about problems. So like what you actually research does not matter, because like the person reading your application probably doesn't do that kind of research anyway. So, you know, that's really all they're looking for. Like, can you appreciate research as a field? Because it is super important for medicine.
And if I could just add, that this is so crucial, and I'm sure you're so over me talking about this like thesis or like your mission in medicine, but it really is important that all parts of medicine are driven by research, and that includes the humanities and the art of medicine. Like we have people who are researching the impact of medicine as an institution on different communities, and that's not at all basic science or hard science research, and it's so vital to how medicine gets delivered, and this is so ultimately there is something there. I just wanted to bring a humanities example because absolutely that is valued and important. It's like both Brandon and George have said, it's about your commitment to a project and your ability to think critically about a question. And if that question happens to be about the delivery of medicine or the history of medicine, those are equally important as the science of medicine. And so as long as you can find, it really depends on like, who do you want to be as a physician? As a physician, you will be contributing to these questions. You will be the ones asking and answering these questions. So like what questions interest you, is really is what you should be basing your research on.
Amazing. Another question that's been coming up is what stands out in applications, and are there specific goal hours that applicants should be hitting in terms of a number of hours for shadowing or clinical experience, research, volunteering? And in your opinions, is there a point at which you kind of cap out in terms of how many hours are too much, or how many hours you think that people should have at a minimum?
I'll go first this time. Hours don't matter. Like I shadowed for like 10 hours and then I was like, all right, I've learned what I needed to learn. Great, let's call it a day. It's really the not even the experience. It's really what you learn from the experiences that matter, right? So like, let's use clinical experiences as an example. Like there are lots of different types of clinical experiences. You can shadow at the hospital. Like there's like care extenders and whatever else they have. Or there's also like, other organizations that work in the hospital. Like the actual organization or experience that you do doesn't really matter, right? Like I remember when I was an undergrad, people always like laughed at care extenders because they're like, oh, they don't do anything. And like these other organizations are better. But like in reality, like what you learn from the experiences and like the stories you can tell from those learned experiences are what really matter. Like I was like a useless volunteer at the hospital as well, but I got to talk to patients. I, made meaningful relationships with these patients, and I talked about it in my essays because they were very meaningful to me. I learned a lot about medicine and why I wanted to do medicine from like a seemingly like stupid hospital volunteering thing. So again, the hours don't matter because like you can learn a lot within like 1 hour in the hospital, right? Like the experience itself doesn't matter. It's really like the meaningful like lessons that you learn from the experiences that you're going to write about in your essays. And truthfully, when I look at applications, I don't look at the number of hours at all.
That makes complete sense, and I completely agree. I think one other thing to use shadowing as is a litmus, is kind of like a litmus test of, do you see yourself in the hospital or in the clinical setting? And although again, as a hospital volunteer or as a shadower, you're technically not engaging in any sort of like clinical activity or not that much. It's a good way of saying, of seeing whether or not you see yourself in the hospital, and like, am I interested in medicine more than just like the textbook stuff? Do I like that patient interaction? But I agree, like it's more so what you get out of it and what stories you're able to tell out of that and what sticks with you rather than X number of hours. Yeah.
I also agree. I just want to say that it should be congruent. And what I mean by that is like, if you're trying to say that you had a long-term commitment to something, but then your hours don't like corroborate that, then that's like a tough story to follow. So just like the only reason why hours matter is like to corroborate what you're trying to say. So if you had a great experience and it didn't take too many hours for you to get that, great. You don't need that many hours for that experience. But if you're trying to say, look, I put a lot of work into this project, or this was really meaningful to me because of how much time I've spent, but then like your hours sort of don't back that up, that's really tough. And especially if it's central to your message of like what your mission in medicine will be, then that can be tough. But if it's not as central, then there's absolutely no minimum. And because of that, there's no like universal minimum for any of these hours. It's really dependent on your application. Just make sure your story flows.
It's all really helpful advice. And as we're starting to wrap up the session, the last big question that I want to ask all of you is twofold. One is, any resources that you found particularly helpful as a pre-med as you were preparing for the MCAT or thinking about writing your personal statements or any part of your application and pre-med journey? And then also, to end it on a positive note, any motivational things, whether experiences as a medical student or things that make you happy to be in medicine.
I'll talk about some of the resources that I used. It's embarrassing that I'm only a few years into med school and I've already forgotten so much. And so I'm sure there's a lot of resources out there that I'm forgetting. I will say the most memorable things and the things I found so helpful was literally just talking to friends and family and people who knew me to be able to review my application. And I think George said this earlier, which is sort of gut check, like, is this authentic? And also to be able to kind of come at me and say like, oh, this is like, I know this about you, but it's not coming through. Like, I know this is a trait you have that you must be really proud of because it's something I know about you, but it's not coming through in your application. Why is that? And so like that kind of gut check was really important for me. So I had a lot of really close friends and family reviewing my application as I was writing it, and that was really, really helpful. But in terms of like paid resources and stuff, like a lot of this stuff can be hit or miss. I don't like really endorse one way or another. It's all like really context dependent. I do want to say shout out to Med Mentors. I think like our one-on-one appointments can be super helpful because when we say context dependent, that's the time where you bring up your context and we'll actually have a conversation about it. So that's something I find really awesome. And just, something that's like been on my mind as like our little motivation to close this out. I am on my clinical rotations right now, and this really does feel like everything I've ever wanted, right? This is what we've been working towards when we were writing those applications, and we wanted to talk to patients and we wanted to have an impact on their care. I feel like I'm doing that. Like, I want you to know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel and it's not far away. And if this is what you're passionate about, writing about it will be easy. It'll come to you and it'll come through, and then you'll be here and you'll be in front of patients and you'll be making a difference. I want you to know that that is a lot closer than you might think.
I definitely agree as well. And I think, as I mentioned, like family, friends, they're going to be the greatest litmus test. And, they'll be able, because they know you so well, they'll be able to, determine if what you're writing is actually genuine and if it's coming across. Another thing that I found helpful was at my school, we have like a writing center. It's just a bunch of like peer tutors, and there's also like a certain faculty. So we just gave them the essays, they would give their feedback, comments, just getting people. So I feel like having two camps of people that look at your essays, one group that knows you really, really well to determine if the content is authentic and if it's actually genuine and if it's true. And then another group of people to determine, okay, they've never seen you before, they don't know who you are, what's actually coming across in your essays. And if I can go on like a 2-second aside with regards to essays themselves, before you start writing an essay, make sure you have like 2 or 3 character traits that you want to convey through that essay. And then think about stories that align with that. Stories, instances in your life that kind of corroborate that. And the whole idea of like showing rather than telling, I think will be incredibly helpful as you start constructing your essays. So before you even start writing, I think having those like 2, 3 character traits that you want to convey, like compassion, creativity, curiosity, those things, I think will be really helpful as you start constructing your essays. And then with regards to the things that have been amazing in med school, I think just having an amazing cohort of students to work with. I mean, I honestly, right now, because I'm in the lab, I'm doing the PhD phase. I honestly miss those days where we'd get together on like Friday mornings. We'd have our case-based learning sessions, and just the amount of like collegiality and amount of like group-based learning was just so exciting. And just being able to see people day in day out, it's like high school, you're all taking the same class together. And it's so much fun. And the fact that like the stuff you're learning, the exciting science you're learning is going to be able to help someone one day, I think just makes it all the more exciting and encouraging. So, it's definitely a tough process applying, but hang in there. And you guys will be on this panel in a few years, encouraging the next group of students applying, but wishing you guys the very best.
I'll wrap it up. Let's see. In terms of resources not to use, I would say don't really listen to your other like pre-med peers, because just like you, they don't really know what the heck they're doing. Med Mentors has medical students who have successfully gone through the whole application process. So like, we know what we're talking about. We've done it successfully. And we know what you're going through. What else was there? Oh, final pieces of advice. You know yourself better than anyone else. Like, your story, your character traits, your own motivations to do medicine. And, if you're being genuine and on paper in your application and in your essays, like that will come across, right? Like when I was applying, I didn't give a shit about what anyone else said about me or what my essay readers would think about me. Like I just put myself on the paper and I was like, this is who I am. If you like me, great, offer me an interview. If not, like, whatever, like F off, like, like someone else will like, someone will like appreciate you for who you are on that paper because it is who you genuinely are. And so, I mean, I know this is not like advice for everyone and, it's very specific to me, but like, I very much felt that like, the application to medical school was very much like putting myself out there and who I was out there. So I took the approach of being like 100% genuine, like take me for as I am. And it worked out. And then, yeah, med school is cool. I kind of went into med school thinking I would be like more on the research side and use medicine as like, have that like medicine foundation to like really boost and bolster and be that foundation for my research. But having gone through, half of my medical training and half of my PhD training, I really do see myself gravitating more towards the medical field more than I thought I would. So yeah, I think the hardest part so far in this whole journey was the whole application process and the MCAT. Fuck the MCAT. Like, the MCAT was the worst time of my life, but if you can get through that, like you're chilling. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Thank you again for all of our panelists for participating in this event. I hope that it was helpful for everyone who attended, and hopefully we got to most of the questions that you all had. And if we didn't, please feel free to schedule an appointment, a one-on-one advising appointment with Med Mentors. We really do want to be there for all of you and answer any personalized context-dependent questions as we talked about during this session. And please give feedback to us. I posted in the chat a link for you all to give feedback. I'll post it again right now, but we really do look at that feedback and use that to build future events. But that being said, unless our panelists have anything, I'll wish you all a good night. All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
Good
you.
night.